First of all, everybody, welcome to Susan's book launch. We are excited that you're here. We have been looking forward to this. This should be a lot of fun. Most of you probably know who Susan is, but I will give you a brief bio of her, a little introduction. Susan N. Swan is a previously published author with a passion for creating historical fiction. She graduated from the University of Utah, where she taught literature and writing until she went into Pepperdine University in California and got a master's degree in clinical psychology. Currently, she is living in Metro Atlanta, where she enjoys writing, traveling, and spending time with her children and grandchildren. She is also the proud member of the Atlanta Writers Club. But this is what a really exciting thing I wanted to share. And you can see here that Angels in the Fog was rated #1 in the new releases in the historical Japanese fiction. So Susan, I am so happy to be here with you today, so we can talk about your Angels in the Fog.
And Brenda, thank you for doing this. Let me just say something about Brenda. So Brenda is a member of my writing critique group, as Jeremy and Tony. And Brenda's graciously agreed to interview me. She also read a lot of my stuff, and I appreciated her comments. And thanks to Tony for jumping in and recording this. You guys are amazing. Thank you.
And thanks to Tony.
We really are a great, it's just a lot of fun to work with all the people in the Atlanta Writers Club, and especially I think our Roswell critique group is a special group. So, when she pre-released this book on Amazon, it was rated #1 in new releases in historical Japanese fiction. That is a great accomplishment. And Susan, I want to congratulate you for that. I mean, way to go. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you. Let me just say one thing about that. So I wasn't even sure it was going to be categorized as historical Japanese fiction, but it was. And I thought, wow, what other books are in this category? So I went on, but there was a book about nurses in Pearl Harbor. There was some other kinds of things that had to do with the war. So I figured this was a good category. And I was happy that it was, going the way it was. So thank you.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Pacific side of your story in a bit. But one thing I want to invite all the viewers that are here this evening is, Susan and we're great friends, and we can chat, and we have chatted over the phone. We can spend an hour, talking about the book. But what we'd really love is to hear your questions. If any of you have read the book, and if there's any character or any situation that you want to ask about, please do. Or if you just have any general questions for Susan, we'd love to hear them, because if you have them, probably somebody else in the audience has them as well. So we're going to keep the eye on the chat and look forward to hearing from you. But in the meantime, I'm going to start asking Susan some questions. So I have read both your historical fiction books, Susan. And the first thing that really jumps out at me is you interweave all these historical facts with a great story and believable characters. And I'm learning things, and I don't even know I'm learning them, but it's done so strongly that I absolutely, believe everything you're telling me. But your research is something you have a passion for. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I actually didn't know I was going to have a passion for it until I started doing it. But it was just fascinating to try to research with a purpose. So I was trying to figure out, okay, when did this happen? How did that happen? It's a little bit like putting a puzzle together. So I really enjoyed it.
So you said something that, you were doing this research because you love it, and you didn't even know you were going to write a novel, a historical novel, with all these characters that you breathe life into. So at what point in your research did you say, wait a second, I can see this story coming?
Well, that's a really great question, Brenda. And you and I talked about this before, and I had to kind of go back and think about it. So the moment that I really felt like I wanted to write a book was in April of 2012. And I didn't really think, oh, I'm going to write a book. I just know I knew I needed to write more about World War II. I needed to know more about my dad's history, who served in World War II, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But my brother Brendan and his wife Marcia were living in the Philippines at the time. So in April of 2012, I went to visit them. And we spent some time in Manila. There's a lot in the book about Manila. There's a lot of sites there. And so thank you for pulling that up. So this is actually in Leyte Beach. Now, when you leave Manila and you go up to Tacloban and you go to Leyte Beach, this is actually where MacArthur came and took back the Philippines. So you've heard I shall return, and MacArthur came to Leyte Beach and he took back the Philippines. So you saw those pictures of the Filipinos actually installed bronze statues, and you can see they're larger than life. And this was a really amazing family moment for me. And that's a picture of me with my brother Brendan. As we were standing there, and I could see what this meant to the Filipino people. And I knew that MacArthur came back to the Philippines and that my dad landed just a couple of days behind that. I thought, there's a story here. And my dad wasn't alive at the time. And I thought, I need to know more about what happened during World War II. And that's kind of the flash moment for me, but it took 10 years. So anyway.
Well, and it's interesting you talk about the Pacific, because as I think about the World War II books and movies and other media that I've digested, it's mostly from the European standpoint. So, and you chose the European, you chose the Japanese, the Pacific Theater, didn't you? And it sounds like it was because of your father's and your family's involvement.
Yes, it was. And I thought originally that maybe I'd do both theaters of the war, but it was just way too much. And I think people do focus on Europe a lot. There are not a lot of people that have told the stories of the Pacific. And there's a big story to tell here. So America didn't even get involved in World War II until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So there's a lot of history about how we got involved and what happened there. And anyway, yes, it all takes place in the Pacific.
All right. And I was kind of hinting at this before with all your research that just seemed so well done and just fit so perfectly in. And I trusted it. I completely trusted that I was learning good stuff. How did you check your facts for accuracy? How did that work?
Okay, well, I did do some cross-referencing. Okay, so I looked at more than one source, but I had kind of a fun thing happen. As I was kind of winding down what I was doing, I was talking to a neighbor of mine, and it turns out her son. Okay, somebody please mute if you just joined. Thank you. It turns out her son-in-law he's just done an amazing amount of work on history in World War II, and he's read almost everything there is to read about it. So he did a fact check for me. And there were a couple little things he found about planes and, various things. So I felt very comfortable having him take a look at it. I felt very comfortable with the facts that I put out there.
And I will point out, you did have a lot of facts in there and a lot of information, but it wasn't overpowering. You've balanced it very well with the story, the characters, the emotions, the feelings, and moving the story along. So, for those of you that haven't read it, I think you're going to really you're going to feel like you're going on a ride. It's a very easy story to get through. So talking about that, first of all, I have a few before I go on to the next thing. Dana says she has just joined the Roswell Critique Group. So welcome, Dana. I can't wait to meet you. But then Kathy Hamby-Swink says she wants to know a little bit about how you got to be a writer and learn the craft of writing. So we mentioned it a little bit in the intro, but you want to share anything more, Susan?
Sure. So I was an English teacher, okay, and I studied that, and I'd always I did a little writing here and there, but I always wanted to do more. And then the way I actually got started was, there's a friend of mine here who's on the chat, whose name is Sunny. And she said to me, I think there's a story you need to write. And she got me started. Sunny's a professional editor. And so we got started and I went from there, and I hope I'm getting better every time, but it's a really fun thing to do. And I was able to do more of it after I retired in 2018. So I've done, this is my second historical fiction, and I'm having a ton of fun, I have to say.
It is fun, isn't it? And I'm going to skip around our questions just a little bit because this seems timely. So you retired in 28 and you began writing, and just about the time you were ready to publish your first book, the pandemic hit. So
Yeah.
As I was reading Angels in the Fog, there was a line in there about how, how we have this crazy normal. So you want to share how writing in the pandemic shaped your story a little bit, or do you think it did?
Absolutely. It absolutely did. As I was reading about what some of the people went through in World War II, as I was reading about how they wished for something to be normal and about how the abnormal had become their new normal. And it was so difficult and how they were cut off from other people. I felt like I could relate to it a little bit. And it was interesting to be writing it during the pandemic because I think I had a little sense of how they were feeling during that time. I mean, not totally, but I think the pandemic has really impacted us all.
Absolutely. And I know as I was reading it too, and I came across that line, like the abnormal is now the normal. Right away I connected with your characters because that's exactly how I think a lot of us are feeling. So it is interesting how real life and art merge so many times. But now I kind of want to go into your family character development. So tell us
Brenda,
who you.
can I just talk about my dad for just a quick minute?
Well, I was just going to say, who did you dedicate your book to?
Okay.
We're on the same page.
Sorry.
No, we're good.
Okay, so again, my dad is a minor historical character in this book. So one of the things that I did before I started actually trying to figure out the events and where it was going to be is I did some historical research on him. And my sister-in-law, Marcia, who's on the call with us tonight, was a huge help. So we put a history is about 50 pages to get with pictures. And one of the reasons we're able to do this is because my grandmother saved all my dad's letters. So he wrote, and he had brothers too, and she saved some of those too, and she saved all the war letters. So what we were able to do, and my dad sadly passed when he was 60. And so that was in 1978. And so I couldn't ask him any questions. But we had all the war letters. And I have a niece whose name is Emily, and she went in and she checked the APO boxes. So what we were able to do is see where he was when during the war. Again, he's a minor historical character. He's not one of the four main characters, but I do work him into the story. And we do kind of follow some of his move through the Pacific. Now, one of the things Brenda and I had talked about is, did he ever talk about the war? Well, like everybody else who served, almost everybody else who served anyway, they don't like talking about the war. It was a really tough time. It was difficult, and they would rather not talk about it. There were a couple ways it came out with my dad, especially growing up. One of the things he used to do when it was time to get up and go to school, if we didn't just like pop right out of bed, he would run around the house singing, "I can't get him up, I can't get him up, I can't get him up in the morning." He was doing the whole, bugler thing. And so we were like, okay, Dad, great. So that was one of the things he did. Another kind of funny thing he did was he spent his leave in Australia. And he loved the Australian. He loved the Australian people. And so he used to go around singing Waltzing Matilda. So we knew a little about Australia. And I did get to go there and spend some time. And we knew a little bit about that. But I cornered him one time about when I was in college. And I said, "Dad, I want to know more. You really don't talk about the war." And he turned to me, and this really stopped me cold. He said, "Susan, during the war, I was a trained killer. That's not the man you want to know." And I just got tears in my eyes. And I thought, yes, that's true. So I had to do more research after the fact, but I think he would have been happy with what we did here.
Oh, I'm sure he's very happy. Now, Jan has a question here, and I think this is a great question. She asked, were the letters censored and with words cut out or anything like that?
Yes, I mean, sometimes the letters were censored. And I think what happened is the men got to the point where they knew their letters were going to be censored. So they were very careful about what they said. And so they didn't talk a lot about some of the real deep details that were going on because they couldn't, because they would have been censored. So, but we did get a sense of where he was. And occasionally he would say something about a bomb or something that would happen, but you're right. We had to be careful because the letters were censored. So we didn't get as much detail as we would have liked.
Now that's an intriguing thought that what you're writing is getting read by complete strangers, so it does.
And blacked out too. Yeah.
Now, you and your sister-in-law, Marcy, had a project. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I just did. So Marcy and
Oh.
I put together the history. And so we found out where he was, and we found out pictures that he had, and we put together a family history of about 50 pages. But that really helped me a lot, because then I knew where he'd served and when, and I had some pictures to back it up. So then I was ready to actually sit down and start thinking, okay, I knew when I wanted to start, I knew when it ended. So what was going to happen in the huge middle?
Yeah, that's a great help. You know, it's nice to have that foundation. So you have other family members that influenced your character development. And I could talk a lot about that you and I have talked about, but I'd rather hear you again. Can you talk about how people in your life influenced your main characters and, other characters?
Sure. So when any author decides to put characters together, they have to go somewhere, right? Have you ever seen the film, The Man Who Invented Christmas? That came out a couple years ago. Some of you have seen it. It's about Charles Dickens. And it's all about how he created the story of A Christmas Carol. All right. And so what he did was, it showed him, he's sitting there having dinner with a friend of his one night. And as they're talking, he says, "There's Marley. I can see it. There's Marley." And he has this tall, thin guy who's kind of looking ghostly. And then another time he's walking around and he runs into this really irritating man when he's at a play or something. And the man, he's just so, and he says, "They should die and decrease the surplus population," and he says, and there's his Scrooge, and he has to come up with the name. So you have to find your character somewhere. Sometimes you can find him sitting in an airport. Somebody starts talking, you think, "Oh my gosh, this would be a great character." In my case, I needed two women particularly. So this story has two women and two men, all from the same family. And I was interested in two women who would be probably in their 20s for sure, probably earlier 20s. So I started thinking about two nieces I have. They're great nieces, actually. I mean, they're like a grandniece, and so a great niece. And they were in high school, and I thought these guys might be great. So I have a great niece whose name is Lucy, and she is in high school, and she loves to paint, and she's very tenderhearted, and she loves to help people. So I started with her as the model for my main character, Lucy. I have another great niece whose name is Hallie, and Hallie is super good at codes. She loves making her own codes. She's very smart, and she likes to just create puzzles. And so then I had my code breaker. So those are the two, and I won't go into a lot more detail, but those were the two that I used for my main female character. I'll just mention one more, and that's Chris. So Chris ends up as a prisoner of war in for the Japanese, and that was horrific, just absolutely horrific, what he went through as a character and as a prisoner of war. Chris is also a nephew. He is a nephew, not a grandnephew of mine. And I chose Chris because he is a man of such outstanding faith. And so my character, the characters are struggling to keep hope and faith alive in a time of crisis. So Chris is a man of faith, and I knew I could count on him as a character to be able to struggle and get through this. So that's a little bit of more background than you probably ever wanted.
Well, no, I think that's really, really interesting. And when you talk about, your grandnieces, Lucy and Hallie, how did people feel that were close to you that weren't included? I mean, did you have any, like saying, "Oh, well, what about me? Aunt Susan?" Did you get any of that?
I did, actually. I won't mention his name because he might not like that. But one of my nephews sent me a text, and he said, "Hey, Aunt Susan, some of my family members are going to be in your story. I heard about this." And he said, "What about me? How do I get it?" Couldn't you at least make him a sandwich after it? So I said, "We can make you a lot more than a sandwich." So I found a place to work him into. So it was really fun. I had a good time. It was great.
Yeah. And you know what? I have a feeling there's going to be other books in your future. So other opportunities for your family members. I do want to, there was a comment here and I have to agree with it. And the person said, "Kudos to your grandmother for saving those letters." I mean, Absolutely. You know, a lot of times we're cleaning our attics or in our basements and say, well, I don't need these. Nobody's going to be interested. But yeah, those kind of things are priceless, you know, even if they might even be painful to have.
Thank you. We were very grateful that she saved the letters, and then she passed them on to my mom, and then my mom passed them on to us. So we were very happy about that.
So who has them now?
Actually, I've got copies of them, and my sister-in-law Marcia that I mentioned, she's got the original. So she and I went back and forth and looked at all the letters, and she's a major family history buff, and so she has saved all those letters. So we're grateful to her too.
Yes, and they're a family treasure for sure. You mentioned Chris being in the concentration camp or the internment camp. That was very painful to read, and it was so. The way that they were treated was so bad. I mean, I think I even asked you, is that really what happened? And it really is. They were really like, they had to do this death march and where they drank water from mud puddles. You know, that's just, it's such an amazing thought that kind of stuff happened. And that's why I think these kind of books are so important to keep us remembering, you know, of these things that happen.
I do think that's important. It was painful to write about it too, because you're talking about the Bataan Death March. And so I have one of my characters, Chris, who goes on the Bataan Death March, and that was a very painful experience that they had. And you're right, being in a Japanese prison camp was horrific. The things that they went through, the Japanese, you know, soldiers, they didn't follow the Geneva Conventions of War. And so things got pretty dicey there. So anyway, yes. It was intense.
Okay, let's see. Oh, there's another question. Let me get it. It looks like it's got it's kind of long. Mimi, that was hard to read about the atrocities of the Japanese, as I know many who are so kind. I related it to Germans under Hitler when the Germans I knew living in Germany for 6 years. So I guess humanity, you know, humanity. So thank you for that comment.
There's a lot that's good about humanity, and there's a dark side too, as everybody knows.
Absolutely. And this book is absolutely trying to focus on the faith and the bright side of it. So, so you had a romance in this book. You want to talk a little bit about your romance that you had in the book?
Sure. So I thought, gosh, you know, we've got two women here. We've got to have some romance going on. I mean, there was a lot of romance that went along during World War II. It was really interesting because people got married fast. They just, and I'm not talking about just people in the United States who married each other. People got married overseas, and there was a lot of people wanting to do that. They needed some hope, and they needed some connection. And so I did have a major romance in the story. It's Lucy, and she falls in love with a man named Matt, and he serves in the Navy and has some pretty horrific war experiences himself. But I did have a beta reader who really liked that. She said, her name is Melissa, and she said, I love the story of Lucy and Matt. She said, it was a great side story. It was a wholesome romance. Thank you for that. So for all you ladies out there, or men who also like romance, there is some romance in there.
Absolutely. And it's very sweet and very tender and very authentic. So another kind of question related to that with Lucy, you opened the story with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, is there a reason that was the particular moment that you chose?
Yes, and I mean, I think I chose it because that's when World War II started. So we were in a situation in our country where we were supporting Britain in their war. We were sending them supplies and weapons and things like that, but we hadn't gotten into World War II as a country at that point. And we were in peace negotiation talks with Japan. I mean, nothing had happened. And we thought, we knew they were feeling a little aggressive, but we were having negotiations. President Roosevelt was negotiating, and negotiations were going on right up until the Japanese flew over and bombed Pearl Harbor on December 8th in the morning, around 8 o'clock, 1941. And so that changed everything. So I wanted to start there because that's when the war started. And that's when President Roosevelt declared war on both Japan and Germany. And that's when it started. So that seemed like a good spot. I had the good fortune at one point in time in my life where the company I was working for, my son had already gone off to college and my daughter was gone too. And my company sent me to Oahu to live on the island to work with the Department of Education. So I was able to live on Oahu for a year and visit the other islands. And so for the 60th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I'm sorry I'm dating myself here, you guys are adding things up going, man, this lady's old. But for the 60th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which would have, that would have been, well, now it's 80 years that the anniversary of 80-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor. But I was able to go to Pearl Harbor. I was able to visit. I was able to get to know things. I went aboard the ships and I went through the memorials, and it was very touching to me to think about what had happened. Now, my dad had joined the Army, but he hadn't gone overseas yet. He was still in Virginia doing his basic training, but then he went quite quickly in February of 1942 to Australia and then to New Guinea. Anyway.
Okay. And we're reading the book too, you can tell that you were in Hawaii. I mean, I really could feel it and smell it and visualize it. I've never been to Hawaii. I know it's an absolute paradise, but that, your experiences really show in your work.
Thank you.
And here's a kind of a more personal question. Hallie's a code breaker, you said before, and then you have Lucy, who's the nurse. And in chapter 6, Hallie says she's being interviewed by somebody that's trying to decide if she's good enough to be a code breaker. And he says, well, you're pretty, you got good grade, but do you have gumption? And can I read her response? Can I do that?
Sure. That'd be great.
Okay. So here's a response, and I just loved it. And I could just see this strong, 20-year-old young woman saying, let me tell you a little bit about gumption and the woman in my family. My great-grandmother dragged a hand cart across the plains alone with 6 children. My grandmother was a suffragist and fought for the right to vote. My mother raised 5 children and now has sent 4 of them to serve our country. And me, I graduated top in my class in math. I can assure you the women in my family do not lack gumption. To me, that felt like very personal, so how is that internalized in yourself, that it came out so strong in your book?
Well, so my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Good Marshall, actually did drag a handcart across the plains. And she was alone with 6 children. She didn't have a husband. And when they left to go across, the men in the company said, especially the guy who was head of the company, said, I don't know if this is such a good plan. I don't think you're going to make it. And she said, not only will I make it, but I'll go there before you do. So when they got to the Salt Lake Valley, she was the first handcart to go into the valley. So that was my great-great-grandmother. And then I have a great-grandmother on a different side of the family, my grandmother Haight. And she actually did some suffrage work in Idaho, because that's where she was living at the time. And in 1896, Idaho granted women the right to vote. So, and I won't go into any details, but some of you may know that the Western states were the first to grant women the right to vote. Wyoming was 1869, Utah was 1870, and Idaho was 1896. So she did some suffrage work there. So I thought about her too. And then my grandmother, who would have been my dad's mom, raised 6 boys. And my grandfather was a country doctor. So she had her hands full trying to raise 6 boys. It was interesting for her, and she sent one of them off to war. So those were the women that I thought of as role models for me.
And again, this might be getting personal, but as you're writing these stories, as you're, forming them, is that something, how do you want to bring that into your women characters, for the young women that are reading them? I mean, is that something you're working towards, or is it just something that just automatically flows?
It's something that just kind of flows. I was in the corporate world for several years, and so I know a little bit about sometimes the prejudice that happens, and I've seen that before. And when women went into World War II, this was a tough thing. I mean, they were asked to come in because the men were busy fighting overseas, and they needed female nurses, they needed female code breakers, they needed Rosie the Riveters to get in there and get going. So, but it wasn't always easy because they weren't always necessarily appreciated, and sometimes they were kind of patted on the head. So I kind of wanted to bring out the Rosie the Riveter kind of side of things, I'll have to admit.
Absolutely. And it kind of feels like with World War II, when women were able to be such great contributors. And once they were out in the workforce, they didn't want to leave that. That was a gift that they got through the war. So,
Well, some of them did and some of them didn't. But the interesting thing about it is that once the war was over, the men came back and they needed the jobs. So there was a shift at the end of the war, and you'll read just a tiny bit about that in the epilogue. So.
Well, and another thing, you were talking about your grandmother being a suffragist, right?
My great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother being a suffragist. And I find that she was a character, Katie was a character in this book. She was a main character as a young woman in Your Sister Suffragettess. And it did tickle me to see her be the grandmother in this book, and how even the influence of Katie, how that impacted her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. So, again, I would recommend both books. They're both great books about women and about history, and you learn a lot.
Well, thank you. If I could just make a comment about that. So after I wrote that book, and I started thinking, okay, so if she had some grandchildren, and then it would have been World War II. So I thought, okay, I'm going to bring her in as the grandmother. So the family's name is the Forrest family, and so she is the grandmother. Her son is Joshua, and he's the father in the family. So Katie was the suffragist, and she also, she's fictional, but she was one of the first women medical doctors in Utah. And there were quite a few women medical doctors in Utah during that time. So, but she's a strong character in this story too. She's very minor, but she does come in occasionally, and I think you'll find the places that she interjects herself are pleasing.
Yeah, it was very tickling to connect the two, even though it wasn't necessary and you didn't need to read one to understand the other, but it was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Brenda. Part of the reason is probably because I'm a grandma myself, and it's like, yeah, let's get the grandma here.
I'm a recent grandma too, and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to make my mark. Absolutely. We feel like that, don't we? We have a special role to play in these children. So
we do. Brenda, I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. So go ahead.
Okay. All right. I just want to go on some of your book club questions, and I'm going to turn them around a little bit.
Okay.
And one is, what 3 words would you use to describe Angels in the Fog?
Well, if I had 3 words, I would describe crisis. That would be my first one. Okay, because this was a crisis of war. And I mean, it was a horrific experience. I mean, we're seeing just some little things going on in Ukraine right now. And I didn't mean to say they were little things, but we're seeing some horrible things that are happening in Ukraine. And we're seeing some possible problems that could be coming up. So this was a huge crisis for people, when all of a sudden they had to be at war, and they were sending their children off at war, and people were dying, and it was horrific. So crisis is one of the words I would use. And then faith and hope would be the 2 other words I would use. So the idea was to try to find how are they coming up with hope? I think when we don't have any hope, we become, and this may be obvious, but we become hopeless. And when we become hopeless, we don't feel like we have any control over anything. So it was, how did they find some hope in what they were doing? How did they keep their faith going in the middle of what was a really horrific situation? So I think those are the 3 words I would use. How about you, Brenda? You read it. What words would you use to this? Let me turn the tables here.
Oh, wow. I think the underlying faith theme for me was very big, because just as you said, because I don't know how you get through these things without having a faith and having that foundation. I think also the bond of their family, the strength of family was very big, and the honor. I think I would look at each character and say each character was full of honor. So absolutely, it was. The World War II was an awful war, but the book is bright. You don't leave thinking, you're not reading it thinking, oh, I don't want to read this. The next page is going to be horrible, even though it's truth and it's, fictional, historical fiction. But there's just so much hope there, and you just know it's going to come out okay. Of course, we have the hindsight of knowing how the war did turn out, but yeah.
Right. Thank you for that, Brendan. And one thing that you made me think of when you said that is we were very united as a country during World War II. You talked about everybody having honor, the characters, but the men and people who served had honor as well. And so we were all united. This was something we had to do. We got behind it as a country. One of the songs that really came out big time during World War II was God Bless America. And I can't even hear it anymore without crying because, there was a year when my dad saw the movie, This Is the Army, that came out, and Kate sang that song. And people were very united and very patriotic because we had to be.
Absolutely. And we need to remember that now. And we can see that with, people pulling together with the Ukrainian situation.
Yes.
We're pulling for the Ukrainians. At least that's kind of the way I've seen it. I have a couple questions in the chat, and I would love to engage those. And let me see. I'm having a hard time with my mouse. Jeremy, could you unmute yourself? My mouse isn't helping me. Oh, there we go. I got it now. Most writers are readers.
Yes.
What authors or books inspired you?
Wow. That's a great question. I'm going to go way back, okay? Because I know it's crazy to go so far back, but when I think about some of the writers that inspired me, especially when I was teaching high school English or when I was reading as a kid growing up, and some of you are going to laugh at this, but one of my favorite characters was Nancy Drew. I love Nancy Drew. I loved her as a character. I loved the way she was trying to always solve problems, and she was doing this kind of thing. And I had kind of a female detective type in Sister Suffragist. So I love mysteries. I love that kind of thing. Virginia Woolf. I was a big fan of Virginia Woolf. I loved Shakespeare. I guess I'm kind of a classics person when it comes to that, but those were some of the things that inspired me.
It's funny that you talk about Shakespeare because I noticed you had some quotes in there and other quotes from other classic books, which, tickled me too as a reader and a writer. I have got another question from Dawn. And he said, when writing historical fiction, how do you balance accurate versus engaging characters? How do you balance that?
Well, I try to make sure it's all accurate. I mean, if you have fictional characters, the conversations they're having are not real. And if you have a fictional character having a conversation with a real person, it's again supposition about what that person might really say, if you know who they are. But I didn't put stuff in there that wasn't factual. I didn't make up things about. In other words, when I had a character, when Chris was at Cabanatuan in the Philippines, there was a Cabanatuan. And when I talked about what happened, this is actually what happened at that prison camp. So I didn't make stuff up. I tried to be true to the movies of the time. I tried to be true to the music of the time. And I didn't, except for the conversations and some of where they went, what was going on, that was factual. I hope that answers the question.
Dawn, did that answer the question? We'll find out in a minute, but we had you and I have had other conversations where you would actually think of when you based these characters on your family, you would actually like close your eyes and say, okay, how would this person respond in this situation? Which I found that to be really, really interesting, and how you get that character to come alive and be human. But to do that with a historical character, that's a whole other level. So I
did a lot of reading. So I mean, MacArthur, obviously Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur was a character in the story. So I read books about MacArthur. I read the conversations MacArthur had, the things he said were things he said. So I didn't make that up.
How long did this take you? I mean, it seems like you did have, even the words and phrases you used, like swell, the party's a gas, you called the boat a tub. And I'm thinking, that's really, how long did it take you to put all this stuff together?
Well, it took me more than 2 years to write the book. So I did a lot of research. I looked to see what some of the dialogue was at the time. I watched a lot of movies about the time period, and I watched, I watched the movie Pearl Harbor, other kinds of things. So it took me a couple of years to get it done, and I'm retired. So it's not like I had to work and write. But I guess one of the things about being locked down during the pandemic is I was locked down. So I had to do something.
But there's always a silver lining in those clouds, right?
There you go.
Okay, let's see. And Dawn said yes, thumbs up for that answer to
Okay,
your
good.
question.
Good.
Let's see. Is there a character, Susan, you would like to meet? Like if you could meet one of your characters and have a conversation with him or her?
Yes, there is. I hadn't thought about that till you asked me, but there is an historical character in this book, and her name is Maxine Tate. Her married name became Maxine Tate Grimm, but she's a Red Cross worker. She was an actual character. She was not fictional, and she worked with the Red Cross. I have her interacting with my character named Lucy. But Maxine was an amazing woman. She went to New York and went to design school. So she was doing some things, and then she went to work in a store. Then her husband died unexpectedly. She ended up joining the Red Cross, and she went overseas, and she was a very interesting woman. One of the things that she did, and you'll read about this in the story, is so Tokyo Rose was a broadcaster from Japan. And there were other broadcasters in Japan. And one of the things that the Japanese did was they broadcast this really horrific propaganda that the soldiers would all hear because they would be tuned into some of the stations. And they would say things like, "Where you live is where you die." Where you live is where you die. Or they'd say, "It's too bad you're not walking down Broadway sipping a Coke instead of getting ready to be killed." So they tried to do everything they could to destroy the morale of the men. And Tokyo Rose was one of the famous men. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of her. Well, one thing that's true about Maxine Grimm is she ended up getting some citations. She went back to Manila. She went back to the Philippines, and Manila was horribly bombed during World War II. And she actually took over to Tokyo Rose's studio, and she started broadcasting happy, good things. She started broadcasting messages of hope. She started broadcasting music. So she was a character that I would love to have met.
I remember Maxine. She was a bright spot. Absolutely. I've got another question here from Sony, and she says, how about your fictional characters? If they suddenly came to life, who was the one drawing you in?
Wow. Thank you, Sonny. That's I'd have to think about that. Who was the one that was really drawing me in? That is a really good question. I think it was probably Chris. So, and it was because of the things that he went through and because of what he had to do and because he was able to try to maintain some hope and faith. And when I thought of him as a character, I did think about some things that happened during World War II. And I did think about some of the Jewish people that had to go through some horrific things, and they had to try to maintain hope, and they had to try to maintain a sense of faith and do some of those things. So I was very drawn to Chris. And then I won't give you too many spoiler alerts, but
let's just tell people who Chris was. I mean,
sorry.
I know we talked about him before, but people might not remember.
Yes. So Chris was a pilot, and he starts out in the Philippines, and he's already in the Philippines when the story starts. So he goes on the Bataan Death March, and he ends up in a concentration camp. And so he's very badly treated, and he almost loses his life, and some really horrific things happen. And so I very much related to him. He drew me into the story. And when he came home, it was so interesting. When the men came home and they'd had to surrender at Bataan, or they were prisoners of war, they weren't sure how they were going to be received. They were afraid, since they'd given up and surrendered, that maybe people would look badly at them. But in fact, they didn't do that at all. And it was such a touching moment for him and for me when I had him come home, and he came into San Francisco, and they started singing "California, Here You Come," right back where you started from. And that's where they left from. They went under the Golden Gate, and they went back. So they left from San Francisco, and they came back there. And I had another moment where I had Chris and one of his brothers and sisters. I had Chris and Alex and Lucy, and they all were able to meet him after the soldiers were liberated from Cabanatuan. And if you haven't seen the movie The Great Raid, You should see it. It's amazing. It happened in January of 1945, and they actually liberated the prisoners of Cabanatuan. It's a great movie.
This is kind of related to that, but was Chris also the favorite person you had when you sat down to write, that you just couldn't wait to put his story down on the page?
No,
Or
not at all.
Who was
Not
your
at all.
favorite character to write?
No, I liked all my characters. I was excited to see where they went. So one of the really fun things, I mean, authors approach things very differently. So there are three kind of categories, if you will, that they've kind of put themselves in. One is a plotter, one is a pantser, and one's a plantser. Okay, so just some people, when they write, they plot everything from beginning to end. And so they know exactly where they start, they know exactly where they go, they know what their characters are doing, and it's a very tightly plotted. I tend to be more of a pantser, maybe a plantser, because I have a general idea of the plot and where things are going. But the really fun thing for me is letting the characters decide where they want to go. So something will happen and I'll think, oh my gosh, this is what they're going to do. Is that real? They really made that decision? You know, and it surprises me. And that's what I love about it, is when the characters change and grow and they take over the story. And I'm just like, okay, so that's where we're going next. That's what I love, love, love about writing fiction. It's awesome.
I think we call that the magic of writing, right, Susan? Because,
Yes, we do.
because I think when you do that and you embrace it in that way, things turn out better than you ever could have thought, you know, when they're on the page. And it's apparent in your book too. I got a couple questions here. One is from Mimi and a related one from Jeremy. Mimi says, do you have a new idea for a book we can look forward to? And Jeremy says, where do you go from here? Other projects, and how can we follow you? And everybody, I did put Susan's website in the chat. But okay, so where do you go from here? What projects, Susan?
Well, funny you should ask that question. And you and I did not discuss this before. So you'll see when you get to the epilogue. So this family had 5 kids, right? There were 4 that were in their, you know, early to late 20s. And then they had, there was a girl named Lily. So Lily is 12 when the story starts. And so now Lily is 17 as we get to the epilogue. And Lily has decided that her dad's an attorney, and Lily thinks she might like to go to law school. And so she's talking to her sister, Lucy, who just got back from the war. And Lucy said, well, that could be tricky. And Lily says, I know it would be a balancing act, but I want to be a mom and a wife and mother and maybe still go to law school. The title of my next book is A Balancing Act. And it's about Lily, who is one of my other nieces, grandnieces.
Oh, that's fabulous. I love it. I love how you weave these things together, and you can read each book separate, but then it's kind of fun when you followed all your work to see how they all connect. So that's fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Here's another one from Kathy Hamby Swink. Did Captain Christopher Plum's story influence Chris's story?
I don't know who Captain Christopher Plum is.
Okay, well then he didn't, right?
No, I don't know who that is. So no, he didn't.
Okay. We're getting towards the end of our time, and if anybody else has any questions, I would encourage you to put them in the chat. But I'm going to share the screen one more time because, Susan, you have also written some books with your grandchildren, and I'd love for you to talk to us about those stories.
Okay, just briefly, I will. So when you go to my website or my blog, if you go up to where the menu bar is, you'll see children's books. So I wanted to put this up there. So this was super fun. And I did not write these books. I put them together. I wrote down their ideas, but these were their stories. So I have a granddaughter named Amelia, who's now 9, Amelia Swan. And so I sat down with her when she was about 4.5, and I said, hey, how about if you and Nana write a book? And she said, what? I said, well, let's think about it. So I asked her a lot of questions. And if any of you are interested, I've got a sheet called How to Create a Book with Your Child. So send me an email through my website and I'll send it to you. But anyway, so we sat down and I said, okay, who's the story about? Where should it take place? What is it going to be like? And she came up with all the ideas and we put it down on paper, and we got an illustrator, and we came up with Amelia's Amazing Adventures, which is a really fun story. We had a great time writing it, and she had fun. Then when my granddaughter Emma, who just turned 6, got to be 4, she said, Nana, where's my book? And I thought, oh, I guess we have to do another one. So we did. We just finished it. It came out last year. It's called Shine Saves the Day. And it's about a lion cub in South Africa. So this was one of the most fun things that I did. It was just so much fun. We just had a great time. The girls were fun. And one of the wonderful things about children, as you all know, because you have those who have children and grandchildren, their imaginations are boundless. So it's so fun to hear what they come up with. So thank you for that question.
And again, the African part, how did you know about the African part? You want to share with the listeners that story?
Well, it was very briefly, I will. So Emma came up with the idea. I asked her, where do you want the story to take place? And she said, Africa. So I said, okay, we'll have to do some research about the setting of Africa. And this was a year and a half ago. And then in January of last year, I came down with COVID. And so I got it. I had a fairly light case. I got over it. And I thought, hey, I now have some immunity. And so what I did then was I have a brother and sister-in-law who are serving a mission in South Africa, and I asked them if I could come and visit. So I went and spent 2 weeks with them in South Africa, and I went on some safaris, and I learned a lot about lions. So anyway, long story long, that's it.
Well, it's just obvious that you write what you know, because when you read, I haven't read the children's books, obviously, but the historical fictions, it feels so real. It feels like you actually, Susan, were there, so it's so brilliant how you did that. And, something that, you said that the theme of your book, and I want to kind of end on this, is faith and hope. And it's, laced throughout the entire book. How has that shaped you? How has your faith and hope shaped you as you travel this life? And how do you want to share that with your readers?
Well, that's a very good question. So I grew up in a very faith-filled family, Christian family, and we're actually members of the LDS Church, Mormon. And so I grew up in a situation like that. And I had a great belief in Christ and in God and had a lot of faith. And then when I turned 45, my marriage fell apart. And I decided, I asked the most stupid of all questions that anyone can ask, which is, why me? It's like, hey, I'm a good person. I did good things. How come something bad happened to me? Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. There's a great book out called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And bad things happen to everybody, bad people and good people. But it caused me to lose sight of my faith for several years. And then I finally came back, and I realized that my life was richer with faith and poor with doubt. So I came back and I regained my faith. I actually wrote a little bit about that too. And so that was an important journey for me. And so, faith is critical in my life. And I do like to interject it in my stories, and how it's impacting the characters. And during World War II, by the way, a lot of people were people of faith, Christian, Jewish, whatever their faith was. They were people of faith. There were a lot of believers. And my dad used to say, there are no atheists in foxholes. Now, I'm sure there were some atheists in foxholes, but that's a time when you're really kind of leaning on, you want to lean on a higher power, I think. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a thing that I have found with faith is when you meet another person of faith, there's an instant bond there,
Yes.
And I feel like you and I have that bond that we're connected together because of that faith. And then when you're in all these horrible situations, how you don't feel alone. You might be alone in that foxhole, right? But you're not if you're connected with others in faith. So,
Brenda, if you don't mentioning, so I am LDS and Brenda's Catholic, okay? But we're Christians and we have that in common, and we did bond. My friend Sunny, who's already left the chat, is Jewish, and she's been a big impact in my life. So I appreciate people of all faiths. So thank you.
Yes, yes. So, are there any other questions any burning questions someone wants to ask before we wrap up? I'm gonna flash up her website one more time so you can see it. And let's see.
And Brenda, let me just say thank you, please, for what you and Tony have done. And Brenda, I appreciate the interviews, and thank you for everybody for joining us. It was so much appreciated. I know you're busy people.
It was a lot of fun, and thank you for sharing your story. And for you viewers out there, thank you so much. And we appreciate your questions and your time. And these are really, both of her books are well done. So I thoroughly endorse them.